Evelyn Harrington leaned closely into the gilded mirror of her Pacific Heights mansion in San Francisco, admiring the absolute perfection of her own skin. It was a crisp November evening in 1967, and the world outside was erupting into protests and counterculture chaos. But inside Evelyn's marble bathroom, there was only serenity. She picked up a heavy, pale ivory bar of soap from a crystal dish. As she worked it between her wet hands, it produced a lather unlike anything she had ever purchased from Paris or London. It was impossibly thick, velvety, and rich, coating her skin like heavy cream. It smelled faintly of wild lavender, sweet almond, and something else, something deep, earthy, and strangely visceral that she could never quite identify, but deeply craved. Evelyn closed her eyes, massaging the luxurious foam into her pores, completely unaware that she was actively washing her face with the rendered abdominal fat of a 22-year-old drifter from Ohio. 200 miles north, nestled against the jagged, fog-choked cliffs of the Northern California coastline, sat the isolated town of Cypress Cove. It was a quiet, forgotten stretch of the Pacific Coast Highway, bypassed by the rapid modernization of the decade. And right at the edge of town, perched overlooking the crashing gray waves, stood a pristine, Victorian-style storefront with a sprawling glass greenhouse attached to its rear. The hand-painted gold leaf on the front window read, Botanica Beaumont. Inside, the air was heavy with the intoxicating aroma of crushed jasmine, distilled rose water, and eucalyptus. Flavia Beaumont stood behind a polished mahogany counter, meticulously arranging small amber glass vials of essential oils. Flavia was a striking woman of 35, an American with deep French lineage. She moved with an elegant, almost predatory grace. Dressed in a sharply tailored emerald green dress, her dark hair pinned in a flawless French twist, she looked entirely out of place in the rugged coastal town. She was a master botanist and a genius perfumer, obsessed with the absolute purity of nature. The heavy wooden door leading to the back room swung open. Consuelo Vargas stepped into a fragrant boutique, entirely shattering the delicate aesthetic. Consuelo was 32, a Mexican-American woman built like a middleweight boxer. She wore heavy leatherwork boots, faded denim, and a thick, chemical-resistant black rubber apron. Her dark hair was severely braided back from her broad, deeply tanned face. While Flavia was the artist, Consuelo was the uncompromising architecture that held the business together. She was a woman of few words, a former assistant to a mortuary embalmer in Los Angeles who possessed a terrifyingly precise, encyclopedic knowledge of human anatomy. "The Elias cooled," Consuelo stated, her voice a low, gravelly baritone. She wiped a smudge of white, caustic ash from her thick forearm. "The temperature is optimal. We need the raw lipids to begin the saponification process." "Excellent, Connie." Flavia smiled, a genuine, warm expression that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. "The San Francisco orders are piling up. We simply must maintain our supply." Their symbiosis was flawless. It was a partnership forged not in friendship, but in a shared, dark epiphany that had occurred exactly 8 months prior. It had started in the unusually sweltering spring of 1967. Before Botanica Beaumont became a sanctuary for elite cosmetics, it was just a struggling apothecary with a leaky greenhouse roof. A transient handyman named Elias had wandered off the Pacific Coast Highway looking for a few dollars. He was young, strong, and entirely disconnected from the world. No family, no fixed address, just a battered canvas backpack. Flavia had hired him to replace the heavy glass panes of the conservatory. By noon, Elias was exhausted, sweating profusely under the blazing California sun. Flavia, ever the gracious host, offered him a tall, frosted glass of iced tea garnished with fresh mint from her garden. Elias drank it greedily. He did not taste the heavy, bitter alkaloid extract that Flavia had meticulously distilled from the roots of Aconitum napellus, commonly known as monkshood or wolfsbane, which she cultivated in the darkest corner of her greenhouse. Within 10 minutes, Elias dropped his hammer. He sat heavily on a wooden crate, his breathing growing shallow. The neurotoxin acted precisely as Flavia's botanical textbooks had promised. It aggressively blocked the sodium channels in his cells. First, a tingling numbness spread over his lips and tongue. Then his limbs turned to absolute lead. He slid off the crate and collapsed onto the dirt floor of the greenhouse, his eyes wide with stark, unadulterated terror. He was entirely conscious, feeling everything, but his voluntary muscles were completely paralyzed. Flavia stood over him, holding a pristine clipboard, clinically noting his respiratory rate as if observing a lab rat. Hearing the heavy thud, Consuelo had emerged from the back room. She didn't scream. She didn't run for the telephone. Instead, the former embalmer walked slowly toward Elias, evaluating his muscular build, his skin tone, and his overall biological mass with a cold, professional detachment. The heart will stop in approximately 4 minutes due to ventricular fibrillation, Flavia had noted, looking at Consuelo. I simply wanted to test the extraction purity. The body, however, presents a logistical disposal problem. Consuelo knelt beside the paralyzed, terrified man. She pressed 2 fingers to his rapidly failing carotid artery. It is not a problem, Flavia, Consuelo had murmured, her dark eyes locking onto the botanist's. It is raw material. That afternoon, in the sterile, tile-lined basement beneath the shop, Consuelo Vargas demonstrated her terrifying proficiency with a surgical scalpel. She worked with the quiet, respectful efficiency of a butcher processing premium livestock. When Consuelo presented Flavia with the rendered, purified human adipose tissue, the botanist had an epiphany. Human fat, rich in perfectly balanced oleic and palmitic acids, was the absolute holy grail of saponification. When mixed with sodium hydroxide, lye, and distilled water, it created a soap of unparalleled, moisturizing perfection. Furthermore, Consuelo methodically crushed the remaining skeletal structure in a heavy industrial bone mill, creating a phosphorus-rich bone meal that Flavia used to feed her rarest, most magnificent orchids. Nothing was wasted. Every ounce of Elias was transformed into beauty, luxury, and botanical perfection. They hadn't just gotten away with murder. They had commercialized it. And as the sun set over Cypress Cove, casting long, bloody shadows across the Pacific, Flavia turned Consuelo in the pristine shop. "Lock the front door, Connie," Flavia whispered, adjusting a delicate vial of rose oil. "It is time to make the soap." The transition from murder to manufacturing was chillingly seamless. For Flavia Beaumont and Consuelo Vargas, the death of the drifter named Elias was not a tragedy, nor was it a burden of conscience. It was an industrial breakthrough. The human body, they discovered, was a treasure trove of raw, unadulterated cosmetic potential. Beneath the pristine, fragrant floorboards of Botanica Beaumont lay a space that stood in stark, terrifying contrast to the elegance above. It was a sprawling, subterranean basement with thick concrete walls, originally built as a cold storage cellar for a 1920s fish market. Now, under Consuelo's pragmatic direction, it had been transformed into a hyper-efficient, sterile laboratory that rivaled any professional mortuary in the state of California. The air down here did not smell of jasmine or eucalyptus. It smelled sharply of industrial bleach, rubbing alcohol, and the heavy metallic tang of iron. In the center of the room sat a slanted, stainless steel embalming table, complete with deep drainage grooves leading directly to a heavy-duty floor sink. Above it hung a bank of blindingly bright surgical fluorescent lights. This was Consuelo's domain. She moved through the basement with the quiet, methodical reverence of a priestess performing a sacred rite. When a harvest was brought downstairs, Consuelo applied the rigorous discipline she had learned from years of working in the shadow of Los Angeles undertakers. She wore a thick rubber apron, heavy gloves, and a clear protective face shield. Her work was entirely devoid of malice. She did not hate the bodies on her table. She respected them for the yield they provided. First came the exsanguination. The bodily fluids were efficiently drained, flushed with chemical solvents, and washed down the deep industrial pipes that emptied directly into the churning, unforgiving tides of Pacific Ocean just beyond the coastal cliffs. The salt water washed away any trace of the biological evidence within seconds. Then, the true work began. With terrifying surgical precision, Consuelo used a number 10 scalpel to carefully flay the skin, seeking out the rich, yellow layers of subcutaneous adipose tissue. The human body yields a surprisingly high volume of fat, particularly around the abdomen and thighs. Consuelo harvested it meticulously, separating it from the muscle and fascia, placing the dense, pale yellow chunks into heavy cast-iron rendering pots. She would boil the fat slowly over low-heat gas burners, a process called rendering. It was a tedious task, requiring constant skimming to remove impurities, connective tissue, and water. What remained after several hours was pure, liquid gold, a flawless, scentless, highly stable lipid base. Once the rendering was complete, Flavia took over. Flavia's side of the basement resembled an apothecary's dream. Glass beakers, long spiraling distillation coils, and heavy wooden curing racks lined the walls. Flavia understood that saponification, the chemical reaction that turns fat into soap, was an exact science. She carefully measured out the rendered human lipid and heated it to exactly 130 degrees Fahrenheit. In a separate heavy-duty Pyrex pitcher, she prepared her lye solution, mixing pure sodium hydroxide flakes into distilled water. The mixture would hiss and spit, triggering a violent exothermic reaction that heated the glass to near boiling temperatures. With her dark hair pinned back and protective goggles over her striking eyes, Flavia slowly poured the caustic lye water into the liquid fat. Using a heavy wooden paddle, she stirred the mixture continuously. Within minutes, the separate liquids would emulsify, thickening into a warm, heavy pudding-like consistency. This was the precise moment Flavia introduced her magic. She would add copious amounts of rare botanical essential oils, Moroccan rose absolute, crushed French lavender, bitter almond, and sweet orange peel, completely masking the clinical origins of the soap. She poured the thick, fragrant sludge into long, wooden rectangular molds lined with wax paper. After 48 hours, the blocks would solidify. Flavia would then slice them into perfect, heavy ivory bars, stamping each one with the elegant Botanica Beaumont crest. But Consuelo's work was never quite finished. To ensure absolute impunity, there could be no physical remains. Once the skeleton was stripped bare, Consuelo employed her most brutal piece of machinery, a heavy, diesel-powered industrial bone mill, originally designed for processing agricultural animal feed. The deafening, grinding roar of the mill was completely swallowed by the sound of the crashing ocean waves outside. The machine aggressively crushed the human femurs, ribs, and skulls into a fine, powdery white dust. This calcium and phosphorus-rich bone meal was then meticulously bagged. Flavia used it as a proprietary fertilizer in her massive glass greenhouse. The results were nothing short of miraculous. Her exotic orchids, delicate ferns, and poisonous nightshades grew to monstrous, vibrant proportions, feeding directly on the pulverized remains of the dead. The greenhouse became a lush, suffocating jungle of unnatural beauty. By the winter of 1967, the consequences of their grim industry were undeniable. Botanica Beaumont had become a sensation. Wealthy socialites from San Francisco and Los Angeles drove their luxury Cadillacs down the winding Pacific Coast Highway specifically to purchase Flavia's miraculous, rejuvenating creams and soaps. The women marveled at how soft their skin felt, entirely ignorant of the macabre irony that they were bathing in the rendered essence of missing vagrants. Flavia and Consuelo were growing immensely wealthy. The struggling apothecary had transformed into a gold mine. The sheer perfection of their system gave them an intoxicating sense of invincibility. They had discovered the ultimate alchemy, turning unwanted human dregs into high society gold, leaving absolutely zero evidence behind. But success breeds a dangerous hunger. By late December, the heavy wooden curing racks in the basement were beginning to look empty. The Elias batch was entirely sold out. The insatiable demand of the California elite was rapidly outpacing their supply. Standing in the sterile basement, peeling off her rubber gloves, Consuelo looked at the empty cast-iron rendering pots. She turned to Flavia, who was tallying a thick stack of $20 bills in the ledger. "We are out of the base lipid," Consuelo stated flatly, her dark eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent light. "The San Francisco orders cannot be fulfilled next month." Flavia paused, her fountain pen hovering over the paper. She looked up, a cold, predatory smile slowly touching her lips. "Patience, Connie. The highway always brings us exactly what we need. We just have to leave the porch light on." The relentless winter storms of January 1968 battered the Northern California coast, turning the Pacific Ocean into a churning cauldron of gray foam and black water. The torrential rain lashed against the heavy bay windows of Botanica Beaumont, keeping the usual influx of wealthy San Francisco patrons firmly away. Inside the shop, the air was warm, thick with the scent of tuberose and cedarwood, but the atmosphere was tense. The heavy curing racks in the subterranean basement were completely empty. The demand for their exclusive soap was soaring, but their crucial macabre supply chain had dried up. Flavia stood by the window, elegantly sipping a cup of black coffee, watching the rain wash over the empty Pacific Coast Highway. Consuelo was in the back, meticulously sharpening her surgical scalpels on a whetstone, the rhythmic shhh sound echoing through the quiet boutique. Just after 3 in the afternoon, headlights pierced the gloom. A battered, beige 1962 Plymouth Valiant sputtered to a halt directly in front of the shop, its radiator hissing a thick plume of steam into the cold rain. The shop bell chimed cheerfully as the front door was shoved open. A man stumbled inside, bringing a gust of freezing wind and the smell of wet wool with him. He was a quintessential casualty of the American road, middle-aged, balding, carrying an extra 40 pounds of soft weight around his midsection, and wearing a cheap, rain-soaked gray suit that clung to his frame. He lugged a massive, waterlogged leather briefcase. "Good Lord, what a deluge!" the man boomed, his voice excessively loud, possessing practiced, artificial cheerfulness of a desperate salesman. He dropped the heavy briefcase onto the pristine hardwood floor, leaving a muddy puddle. "Pardon the intrusion, ladies. The name is Chester Gable, like the actor, but with less hair and a worse car." He laughed loudly at his own rehearsed joke. Flavia did not smile. She simply stared at his midsection, her mind instantly calculating the lipid yield. Consuelo stepped out from the back room, a polishing cloth in her hand, her dark eyes instantly locking onto the stranger like a hawk spotting a plump field mouse. "My radiator just blew a gasket about a mile back. Managed to coast it here," Chester continued, wiping rain from his face with a crumpled handkerchief. "I'm selling the 1968 Collier's Encyclopedia set, direct to the educated consumer. But honestly, right now, I just need to use your telephone to call a tow truck out of Eureka. My wife will have my head if I'm not in a motel by sundown, though honestly, she barely notices when I'm home anyway." He chuckled nervously, oversharing the tragic mundanity of his life. A traveling salesman, far from home, an unhappy marriage. Flavia and Consuelo exchanged a single microscopic glance. It was a silent, absolute consensus of 2 apex predators. "Mr. Gable, please, coming out of the cold," Flavia said, her voice dripping with sudden velvet warmth. She stepped out from behind the mahogany counter. "The telephone lines have been down since the storm started this morning. We are quite isolated here. But please sit by the radiator. Let me pour you a cup of hot tea to warm your bones while we wait for the weather to break." Chester sighed heavily, sinking into a plush velvet armchair near the heat, his guard completely dropping. "You are a saint, lady, a genuine saint. It's brutal out there on the road." Flavia glided into the back room. When she returned, she carried a delicate porcelain teacup on a silver tray. The tea was a fragrant Earl Grey, heavily spiked with a concentrated aconitum napellus extract she had freshly synthesized in the greenhouse. She handed it to him with a sympathetic smile. Chester drank half of it in one desperate, scalding gulp. "So, about those encyclopedias." He began, unlatching his heavy briefcase to pull out a sample volume. "If you ladies have children or just a thirst for knowledge." He stopped. The heavy book slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a loud thud. Chester blinked rapidly. His lips had gone completely numb, a strange, electric tingling spreading across his face. He tried to speak, but his tongue felt like a block of dead wood. Flavia stood perfectly still, watching the chemical reaction take hold. Consuelo slowly put down her polishing cloth and walked toward him, her heavy leather boots completely silent on the floorboards. Chester's eyes widened in sudden, stark terror. He tried to stand, to run toward the door, but the neurotoxin had already severed the communication between his brain and his muscles. He was entirely paralyzed. He slumped back into the velvet armchair, trapped inside a rapidly failing biological cage. He could see Flavia's elegant, cold smile. He could feel Consuelo's strong fingers pressing firmly against his neck, checking his pulse. He could hear his own heartbeat slowing down. "A magnificent yield, Connie," Flavia whispered, looking at Chester's soft, well-fed frame. "We can fulfill the San Francisco orders and double our reserve." 3 minutes later, the salesman was dead. Consuelo effortlessly hoisted Chester's heavy, lifeless body over her broad shoulder, carrying him toward the basement door. But as she turned, she looked through the front window. The beige Plymouth Valiant was still sitting on the curb, violently hissing steam. "Flavia," Consuelo said, her voice a low, urgent rumble. "The vehicle, the drifter had nothing, but this man has a car registered to his name, a license plate. If the highway patrol sees it parked outside our shop, they will knock on our door." Flavia's cold smile vanished. She understood the logistical nightmare immediately. A missing person was a tragedy. A missing person with an abandoned car parked outside a specific address was a glaring, neon sign pointing to a crime scene. "Can you move it?" Flavia asked, her tone entirely clinical. Consuelo nodded slowly. She lowered Chester's body to the floor and reached into his damp trench coat, retrieving a ring of cheap brass keys. At midnight, the storm escalated into a howling, torrential gale. Consuelo stepped out into the freezing rain, dressed in a dark raincoat. She forced the Plymouth's engine to turn over, the vehicle groaning in protest. She drove it north along the treacherous, winding cliffs of Pacific Coast Highway, keeping the headlights off to avoid being seen by any passing long-haul truckers. 3 miles up the road was a notorious stretch of asphalt known as Devil's Drop, a sharp, blind curve overlooking a sheer 200-foot cliff that plunged directly into the violent, rocky surf. It had claimed dozens of drunk drivers over the decades. Consuelo parked the car at the edge of the gravel shoulder, leaving the engine running. She used her handkerchief to meticulously wipe down the steering wheel, the gear shift, and the door handles, removing any trace of her fingerprints. She shifted the car into drive, stepped out into the freezing rain, and reached to the open window to lodge a heavy rock onto the gas pedal. The Plymouth's tires spun in the mud for a fraction of a second before the car launched forward. It tore through the flimsy wooden guardrail and disappeared into black abyss. Seconds later, Consuelo heard the distant, satisfying crunch of metal hitting jagged rocks, completely swallowed by the roar of the ocean. Consuelo pulled her collar up against the freezing rain and began the 3-mile walk back to the shop in the pitch black. The problem was solved. The accident was staged. The raw materials were secured. The perfect business would continue. By the spring of 1968, the cultural tectonic plates of America were shifting violently. But inside the sprawling glass conservatory of Botanica Beaumont, time was measured only by the blooming cycles of rare flora. The greenhouse had become a terrifying, magnificent jungle. The heavy, calcium-rich bone meal produced from the pulverized skeletal remains of Elias the Drifter and Chester the Salesman had fundamentally altered the soil chemistry. Flavia Beaumont exotic orchids, specifically her Pries Angricum sesquipedale and her deadly nightshades, had mutated into monstrous, vibrant spectacles of botanical perfection. The leaves were an unnaturally deep, glossy emerald. The blossoms were the size of dinner plates, radiating a heavy, narcotic perfume that masked a faint, lingering smell of industrial bleach wafting up from the basement grates. It was mid-May when the bell above the shop door chimed, cutting through the serene silence. The girl who walked in was a living embodiment of the era's counterculture. She called herself Starling, though her California driver's license, which Consuelo would later burn in the basement incinerator, identified her as Mary Ann Miller from Fresno. She wore a tattered, muddy patchwork skirt, a crocheted halter top, and absolutely nothing on her feet. Her long, unwashed blonde hair was tangled with daisy chains, and she smelled sharply of cheap patchouli oil and damp earth. She was a runaway, hitchhiking up the coastal highway toward the promised utopia of Oregon. Starling wandered through the pristine boutique, her dilated, glassy eyes wide with awe. She ran her dirt-stained fingers over the immaculate glass displays, leaving smudges on the crystal vials. Flavia stood rigidly behind the mahogany counter, her jaw tight, fighting a wave of profound aesthetic disgust. "Oh, wow," Starling breathed, her voice a slow, breathy drawl. She wandered toward the heavy glass doors of the greenhouse, pressing her face against the pane. "The vibrations in here are incredible, man. The energy, it's so pure. You can, Feel the Earth Mother breathing through these plants. Consuelo stepped out from the back room, a heavy sack of raw lice slung over her broad shoulder. She paused, assessing the young, slender girl with the cold, calculating gaze of a butcher evaluating spring lamb. There wasn't much lipid volume on her frame, but what was there would be exceptionally pure, uncontaminated by the heavy alcohol and tobacco abuse that had tainted the salesman's yield. Flavia's annoyance seamlessly transformed into her trademark, predatory grace. She glided out from behind the counter. The earth provides exactly what we need if we know how to ask, Flavia purred, her voice a soothing, hypnotic melody. She unlocked the greenhouse doors, allowing a wave of humid, floral air to wash over the girl. Please step inside. The orchids are at their absolute peak today. Starling drifted into the conservatory, like a moth drawn to an open flame. She reached out, delicately touching the massive, fleshy petals of a ghost orchid rooted in a dark, rich mound of potting soil that was heavily fortified with the powdered femurs of Chester Gable. I make custom essential oil blends, Flavia said softly, stepping up behind the young girl. She held a small, dark amber vial in her immaculate hand. I can sense your aura is incredibly vibrant. It requires a specific grounding frequency. Would you like to try a sample? It's a completely natural extract. I would love that. Starling smiled, a genuine, naive expression of absolute trust. She held out her wrists. Flavia uncorked the vial. Inside was not a perfume, but highly concentrated, transdermally active suspension of her Aconitum napellus neurotoxin, blended with a rapid-absorbing carrier oil. She dabbed a generous drop onto the pulsing veins of Starling's wrists. Rub them together, Flavia instructed gently, and take a deep breath. Starling obeyed. She rubbed her wrists, pressing the potent alkaloid directly into her bloodstream, and inhaled deeply. It smells like almonds and cold dirt. It's heavy, beautiful, but heavy. It took less than 60 seconds. The carrier oil breached the dermal barrier with terrifying efficiency. Starling blinked slowly, a look of mild confusion crossing her youthful face. Hey, my fingers are there buzzing. My arms feel reely. She tried to take a step back, but her bare feet wouldn't respond. The paralysis hit her central nervous system like a sledgehammer. The heavy, peaceful smile froze permanently on her face as her knees buckled. She collapsed backward into a dense patch of broadleaf ferns, perfectly conscious, her eyes wide, staring up at the glass ceiling of the greenhouse. Consuelo entered the greenhouse a moment later, pushing a heavy, rubber-wheel garden cart. She didn't say a word. She simply lifted the paralyzed, terrified girl by her arms and legs, depositing her gently into the cart before tossing a heavy canvas tarp over her. Down in the sterile basement, the processing of Starling was swift and surgical. The girl's youthful adipose tissue yielded a remarkably light, sweet-smelling lipid base. When Flavia mixed it with lye and infused it with wild jasmine, it created the most exquisite, translucent glycerin soap the shop had ever produced. It sold out to the San Francisco elite in 3 days. But it was Starling's bones that caused the real complication. 2 weeks after the Runaway was rendered into bone meal and folded into greenhouse soil, the flora reacted violently. The infusion of fresh, nutrient-dense marrow caused a rare, dormant Amorphophallus titanium, a corpse flower Flavia had been trying to cultivate for years, to suddenly and aggressively bloom. The flower shot up to a monstrous height of 7 feet, its dark burgundy petals unfurling in a spectacular, grotesque display. The bloom was so magnificent and so incredibly rare for the Northern California climate that it could be seen clearly through the greenhouse glass from the street. The next morning, Flavia walked out to the front of her shop and froze. Standing on the sidewalk, pressing an expensive Kodak camera against the conservatory glass, was Mrs. Eleanor Higgins, the president of the Cypress Cove Beautification Committee. Flavia, darling, Mrs. Higgins gasped, lowering her camera, her eyes wide with astonishment. I was just walking by, and I couldn't believe my eyes. A blooming titanarum. In this weather, it's an absolute botanical miracle. What on earth are you feeding your soil? Flavia offered a tight, perfectly practiced smile, her mind racing. Just a proprietary organic compost, Eleanor, sourced locally. Well, You simply must let the local gardening club feature it in the town newsletter, Mrs. Higgins insisted, snapping another photograph. Everyone is talking about your shop, Flavia. The whole town is just absolutely captivated by what you're doing in there. As Mrs. Higgins bustled away, Flavia watched her go, a cold knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The perfect isolation of Botanica Beaumont was cracking. They had desired success, but they had accidentally cultivated an exhibition. And in their line of work, the spotlight was the deadliest poison of all. The front page of the Cypress Cove Chronicle usually featured nothing more thrilling than high school baseball scores or the annual Clam Chowder Festival. But in the first week of June 1968, the headline belonged to Flavia Beaumont. A grainy black and white photograph of the blooming Amorphophallus titanum sat squarely beneath the fold, accompanied by a glowing article written by Mrs. Higgins praising botanical miracle occurring right on the edge of town. For Flavia, the ink on that page felt like a death warrant. While the wealthy women of San Francisco clipped the article and flooded the shop with mail orders, a different kind of reader took notice. Arthur Pendleton was a chain-smoking, cynical investigative journalist who had been exiled from a major Chicago newspaper years ago due to a drinking problem. He was 50, sharp-eyed, and profoundly bored with Cypress Cove. When he read about Botanica Beaumont's impossible success, his journalistic instincts flared to life. Arthur did the math. Cypress Cove was a geographical dead end. To manufacture the sheer volume of luxury soap, lotions, and organic fertilizers Flavia was shipping across the state, she would need hundreds of gallons of base lipids, tallow, palm oil, or sheer lard. Yet, Arthur spent 3 days monitoring the Pacific Coast Highway from a diner booth. Not a single commercial freight truck or chemical delivery then ever pulled into the shop's driveway. The raw materials simply didn't exist, yet the finished product poured out by the crate. On a foggy Tuesday afternoon, Arthur pushed open the heavy oak door of the boutique. The bell chimed, and the thick scent of lavender and render fat hit him like a physical wall. "Good afternoon," Flavia purred from behind the counter, her eyes immediately registering his cheap, rumpled suit and the heavy nicotine stains on his fingers. He was not a customer. "How may I help you?" "Arthur Pendleton Chronicle," he said, producing a press pass. He leaned casually against a glass display case, his eyes darting toward the heavy wooden door leading to the back room. "I'm doing a follow-up piece on your little botanical empire, Miss Beaumont. It's a fascinating operation. But I have to ask, where exactly do you source your base oils?" "I checked the local shipping manifests at the county depot. You haven't received a commercial delivery of raw fats or lye since you opened." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. From the shadows of the back hallway, Consuelo emerged. She stood completely still, a heavy wrench loosely gripped in her calloused, gloved hand, her dark eyes locking onto the reporter. Flavia did not flinch. Her smile remained a flawless porcelain mask. "We use a proprietary blend of locally foraged botanicals and cold-pressed seed oils, Mr. Pendleton. My partner, Consuelo, handles the private sourcing. It is an industry secret, I'm afraid." "Locally foraged?" Arthur chuckled, a dry, scraping sound. He pulled a notepad from his pocket. "You're selling 300 pounds of artisanal soap a month. You can't squeeze it out of local sunflower seeds. Something here doesn't add up." "I am afraid I must ask you to leave, Mr. Pendleton," Flavia said, her voice dropping its warm cadence, becoming as sharp as broken glass. "We have a business to run." Arthur tipped his fedora, a smug, knowing smile on his face. "I'll be in touch, ladies." That night, a thick, impenetrable marine layer rolled off the Pacific, blanketing Cypress Cove in a dense, freezing fog. At 2 a.m, Arthur Pendleton returned to the shop. He parked his car a mile down the road and hiked through the wet grass, carrying a heavy steel flashlight and a crowbar. He wasn't going to wait for an interview. He was going to find the supply depot himself. He bypassed the front door and moved toward the massive glass greenhouse in the rear. Slipping the crowbar into the latch, he popped the lock with a quiet, metallic snap. Arthur stepped into the conservatory. The humid, heavy air instantly caused his clothes to stick to his skin. The smell of the blooming corpse flower was horrific in the dark, a thick, rotting stench that made his stomach churn. He clicked on his flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the dense foliage. He illuminated a heavy burlap sack stacked near the potting benches, stamped with the words, Beaumont Premium Bone Meal. Arthur pulled a pocket knife, sliced a small slit in the burlap, and caught some of the coarse, white powder in his palm. He rubbed it between his fingers. It felt greasy, heavy, and distinctly different from any commercial fertilizer he had ever seen. "Looking for a scoop, Mr. Pendleton?" A voice whispered from the darkness. Arthur spun around, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the dirt floor, its beam illuminating a pair of heavy leather work boots. Consuelo Vargas stepped out from behind a massive fern. She moved with terrifying silence. Before Arthur could scream, before he could even raise his hands to defend himself, Consuelo lunged. She didn't use a weapon. She slammed a thick, chemically soaked rag directly over his nose and mouth, pinning his head back with brutal, inescapable force. The rag was completely saturated with a hyper-concentrated distillation of Flavia's aconitum napellus toxin. Arthur thrashed wildly, his fists pounding against Consuelo's solid, muscular frame, but she absorbed the blows like a stone wall. He was forced to inhale. The toxic alkaloids flooded his respiratory system. Within 10 seconds, his arms went numb. His legs buckled. The flashlight beam flickered on the glass ceiling as Arthur collapsed into the dirt, entirely paralyzed, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. Flavia stepped out of the shadows, wearing her pristine emerald dressing gown. She looked down at the paralyzed reporter with profound irritation. "You are a nuisance, Mr. Pendleton," Flavia sighed, adjusting her silk cuffs. "And your liver is likely ruined by cheap bourbon. The lipid yield will be abysmal. Take him downstairs, Connie. Process him quickly. We must scrub the greenhouse." Consuelo dragged the paralyzed, fully conscious journalist toward the basement door. He felt every bump, every cold concrete step, as he was hauled down into the blinding surgical lights of the slaughterhouse. He saw the stainless steel table. He saw the bone mill. And then he saw nothing else. By sunrise, Arthur Pendleton had been permanently liquidated into a fresh batch of heavy-duty industrial degreaser, and his skeleton was pulverized to feed the very plants he had been investigating. The women meticulously cleaned the greenhouse, erasing every footprint, every trace of the break-in. They had survived the intrusion. They felt invincible. But as the morning sun hit the dusty windows of the Cypress Cove Chronicle building across town, it illuminated Arthur's cluttered desk. Sitting perfectly centered on the ink-stained blotter was his heavy Underwood typewriter. Rolled into the carriage was a half-typed article, and pinned to the corkboard directly above it, connected by a web of red string, were photographs of the missing drifter Elias, the missing encyclopedia salesman Chester Gable, and the missing runaway girl. In the center of the string web, circled in thick black marker, was a single, damning phrase. Where does the fat come from? Ask Botanica Beaumont. Arthur Pendleton had missed deadlines before. Usually, it was a result of a 3-day bourbon bender in a cheap Eureka motel, followed by a sheepish return to his desk at the Cypress Cove Chronicle. But when Thursday morning rolled around and Arthur's chair remained empty, his editor, a gruff man named Henderson, finally decided to check the reporter's small, cluttered office at the back of the bullpen. Henderson pushed the door open, waving away the stale smell of old tobacco. He expected to find empty glass bottles. Instead, he found a meticulously constructed map of madness. Pinned to the corkboard directly above Arthur's heavy Underwood typewriter was a web of red string. It connected the newspaper clippings of 3 missing persons: Elias the drifter, Chester Gable the traveling encyclopedia salesman, and Marion Miller, a teenage runaway. Arthur had drawn a bold, black circle around the geographical location where their trails had definitively vanished. Cypress Cove. And right in the center of the web, anchored by a heavy thumbtack, was a photograph of Flavia Beaumont's spectacular blooming corpse flower. Beneath it, the half-typed page in the carriage read, "The math doesn't work. The volume of product requires hundreds of pounds of rendered lipids. Where does the fat come from? Ask Botanica Beaumont." Henderson stared at the board, a cold chill running down his spine. He immediately picked up the telephone and bypassed the local sheriff entirely. He called the California State Bureau of Investigation in Sacramento. By Friday afternoon, Senior Investigator Silas Thorne arrived in Cypress Cove. Thorne was a man who looked like he had been carved out of weathered driftwood. He was 45, lean, and possessing a sharp, predatory intellect that had successfully hunted down some of California's most elusive predators. He did not wear a uniform. He wore a sharply pressed gray suit and a tan trench coat, his eyes hidden behind dark aviator sunglasses. He was a man of logic, geometry, and motive. He did not believe in coincidences. He set up his temporary headquarters in the back room of the Chronicle, staring at Arthur's murder board. Pendleton was a drunk. Investigator, the local sheriff, a heavy-set man named Miller, said nervously, leaning against the doorframe. He saw conspiracies in his coffee cup. Gable's car went off Devil's Drop. The drifter probably caught a train out of Eureka. The hippie girl? Who knows where those kids wander off to? It's a coincidence. Thorne slowly took off his sunglasses, his pale blue eyes pinning the sheriff to the wall. 4 people vanishing within a 20-mile radius of a town with a population of 800 is not a statistical anomaly, Sheriff. It is a hunting ground. And Pendleton found the blind. Thorne spent the next 48 hours systematically retracing the victim's steps. He drove the winding, treacherous curves of Pacific Coast Highway. He stood at the edge of Devil's Drop, looking down at the jagged rocks where the beige Plymouth Valiant had been swallowed by the surf. He noted the sheer, impassable cliffs on one side of the highway and the dense, impenetrable redwood forests on the other. Cypress Cove was a geographical bottleneck. Anyone traveling through had to pass directly down Main Street. And right at the edge of that bottleneck, sitting like a polished jewel box, was Botanica Beaumont. On Monday morning, a heavy, cold coastal fog rolled in from the ocean, blanketing the town in a damp gray haze. Thorne parked his unmarked Plymouth Fury a block away from the apothecary. He did not go inside. He sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, the windows rolled down slightly, observing the ecosystem of the shop with the patience of a sniper. At 9 o'clock, the heavy oak door swung open. Flavia Beaumont stepped out onto the porch to sweep the pristine wooden floorboards. Thorne watched her through a pair of compact field binoculars. He noted her elegant, perfectly tailored dress, her immaculate hair, and the effortless, aristocratic way she moved. She did not look like a killer. She looked like a wealthy socialite. But then, the heavy side door of the greenhouse opened. Consuelo Vargas emerged, wearing her thick rubber boots and a canvas work jacket. She walked to the back of a delivery truck that had just pulled up. The driver, a skinny local teenager, struggled to push a heavy wooden pallet of empty glass vials toward the edge of the gate. Consuelo didn't wait for him. She stepped up, gripped the heavy wooden crate with her bare, callous hands, and effortlessly hauled the 150-pound load onto her shoulder. She carried it into the shop without breaking a sweat, her face a mask of absolute, stoic concentration. Thorne lowered his binoculars, his jaw tightening. He had seen that kind of purely functional, terrifying physical strength before, usually in slaughterhouses or morgues. He looked back at his notebook, running his pen over Arthur Pendleton's final question. Where does the fat come from? Thorne knew that to manufacture high-grade artisanal soap, you needed an incredible amount of lye and an even greater amount of animal fat. If they weren't importing tallow or palm oil, there was only one other biological source capable of providing that volume of lipids. The realization hit him with a sickening, heavy wave of revulsion. The math was horrifyingly simple. An average adult male could yield up to 30 pounds of usable adipose tissue. They weren't just killing people. They were rendering them. Thorne closed his notebook and started the engine of his Plymouth. He wasn't going to send the local police in. The sheriff was a fool who would trip over his own feet and give the women time to destroy whatever evidence remained in that immaculate shop. Thorne shifted the car into drive. He was going to walk through the front door of Botanica Beaumont himself. He needed to look Flavia Beaumont directly in the eyes, breathe the air inside that shop, and see if he could smell the slaughterhouse hiding beneath the heavy perfume of wild lavender and crushed roses. The brass bell above the heavy oak door of Botanica Beaumont chimed, a bright, cheerful sound that felt entirely at odds with the grim calculations occupying senior investigator Silas Thorne's mind. He stepped over the threshold, and the sensory assault was immediate. The air inside the boutique was thick, humid, and heavily perfumed. It was a suffocatingly beautiful wall of crushed jasmine, sweet almond, and distilled rose water. But Thorne Having spent 20 years walking into slaughterhouses, morgues, and crime scenes, possessed a highly educated nose. Beneath the intoxicating floral top notes, he detected the faint, undeniable, and heavy base note of rendered biological fat. It was the smell of a butcher's shop that had been aggressively scrubbed with French perfume. Flavia Beaumont stood behind a polished mahogany counter. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal gray dress that accented her striking, aristocratic features. When she saw Thorne, her lips curved into a flawless, welcoming smile, but her eyes, sharp, cold, and highly intelligent, instantly categorized him. He did not wear the expensive, relaxed linen of a wealthy tourist. He wore the stiff, practical gray suit of a man who worked for the state. "Good morning, sir," Flavia purred, her voice a smooth ribbon of velvet. "Welcome to Botanica Beaumont. How may I assist you today?" Thorne approached the counter, taking off his fedora. He offered a polite, practiced smile that completely failed to reach his pale blue eyes. "Morning, ma'am. I'm in a bit of a bind. It's my 15th wedding anniversary this weekend, and I'm afraid I've left my shopping entirely to the last minute. The ladies at the diner down the road said your shop was the only place in town that could save my life." "They are too kind," Flavia replied smoothly, stepping out from behind the counter to guide him to a crystal display table. "We specialize in exclusive handcrafted botanical cosmetics. Is your wife fond of floral scents or something more grounding? Earthy, perhaps?" "She has very sensitive skin," Thorne lied effortlessly, picking up a heavy pale ivory bar of soap. He turned it over in his hands, feeling its dense, luxurious weight. He knew exactly what it was made of. The realization made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, but his hand remained perfectly steady. "This is incredibly rich. I've never seen a texture quite like this. What's the base?" Flavia's smile tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. It was a microscopic shift, but Thorne caught it. "It is a proprietary blend, Mr. Thorne. Silas Thorne. Mr. Thorne. We use a complex saponification process. High-yield, cold-pressed seed oils blended with organic botanicals cultivated right here in our own greenhouse." Thorne looked around the immaculate shop, his eyes lingering on the heavy wooden door that led to the back rooms. Fascinating. But the chemistry of soap-making requires a substantial lipid base to achieve this kind of lather. Tallow, palm oil, or sheer lard. And you're selling an incredible volume, judging by the shipping crates I saw out back. You must have a massive commercial supplier for your raw fats. The psychological duel began. The air in the shop suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. Flavia realized instantly that she was not speaking to a forgetful husband. She was speaking to a predator who had just walked into her den. "We are a boutique operation, Mr. Thorne," Flavia said, her voice dropping its warm cadence, becoming sharp and defensive. "My partner and I source our materials very carefully, through private, local channels. I assure you, trade secrets are the lifeblood of our industry. Surely a man of your analytical nature understands the value of discretion." "I understand chemistry, Miss Beaumont," Thorne said softly, placing the bar of soap back onto the crystal dish. "And I understand logistics. Sometimes things just don't add up, no matter how much perfume you pour over them." While the silent war raged in front of the shop, Consuelo Vargas was in the subterranean basement, working with rare, dangerous haste. Normally, Consuelo was a machine of methodical precision, but the unexpected arrival of the Investigator upstairs, she had seen Thorne's unmarked Plymouth Fury pull up through the basement window grate, had thrown her off her rhythm. She needed to prepare an urgent order of bone meal fertilizer for Thomas Abernathy, an elderly local landscaper whose pickup truck was currently idling in the back alley. Consuelo stood before the heavy, diesel-powered industrial bone mill. The machine was a beast of iron and grinding gears. She had recently run the skeletal remains of Arthur Pendleton through the hopper, but she needed more volume to fill Abernathy's order. She reached into a heavy plastic storage bin containing the older, processed bone fragments from Chester Gable, the Encyclopedia Salesman. What Consuelo did not realize was that Chester Gable had shattered his left femur in a severe car accident in 1959. Surgeons had repaired the bone with a solid, 5-inch titanium intramedullary pin. Titanium is one of the strongest metals on Earth. The heavy bone mill had failed to crush it months ago, Instead, the pin had simply jammed against the internal steel grate, hidden by a thick layer of white calcium dust. As Consuelo aggressively scooped the remaining bone meal into a heavy, 10-pound burlap sack, she struck the side of the bin with her metal scoop. The vibration dislodged the heavy titanium pin. With a dull, completely unnoticed clink, the 5-inch metal rod fell directly into the burlap sack, instantly buried beneath layers of pure white human bone powder. Consuelo tied off the top of the sack with thick twine, entirely unaware that she had just packaged a piece of irrefutable, indestructible forensic evidence. She hauled the sack over her shoulder, walked up the basement stairs, and out the back door to hand it directly to Mr. Abernathy. Inside the shop, Thorne had seen enough. He didn't have a warrant yet, and pushing Flavia further, without one would only trigger her to destroy the laboratory. "Well, I believe I'll take 3 bars of the lavender," Thorne said, his tone suddenly light and completely normal. He pulled a crisp $20 bill from his wallet. Flavia meticulously wrapped the macabre bars in wax paper, her hands perfectly steady, though her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She handed him the brown paper parcel. "Happy anniversary, Mr. Thorne. I hope your wife enjoys the lather." "Oh, I'm sure she will," Thorne replied, tipping his hat. "I have a feeling I'll be seeing you again very soon, Miss Beaumont. This town is full of surprises." Thorne walked out into the cold coastal fog. He didn't look back. Flavia locked the front door, her porcelain mask finally shattering. She walked rapidly toward the back room, her emerald heels clicking furiously against the floorboards. Consuelo had just returned from the alley, wiping her calloused hands on a rag. "Pack up the ledgers. Shut down the rendering pots. Flush the basement drains with industrial bleach," Flavia ordered, her voice trembling with absolute, unfiltered panic. "That was not a customer, Connie. That was state police. They are hunting us." Thomas Abernathy was a man of simple, quiet pleasures. At 68 years old, the retired naval mechanic's entire world revolved around the meticulous care of his front yard garden, specifically his prize-winning hybrid tea roses. He had heard the relentless, glowing gossip from Mrs. Higgins about the miraculous fertilizers being sold at Botanica Beaumont, and despite the steep price, he had purchased a heavy 10-pound burlap sack of their premium bone meal. It was a crisp Thursday morning. The coastal fog was just beginning to burn off under the California sun. Thomas knelt in the damp, rich soil of his flower beds, wearing worn denim overalls. He used a sharp steel trowel to dig a shallow trench around the base of a struggling crimson rose bush. Reaching into the burlap sack, he scooped out a generous mound of coarse, heavy white powder and sprinkled it into the earth. He plunged his trowel into the dirt to mix the fertilizer. Clink. The sharp, metallic sound stopped him. It wasn't the dull thud of a river stone, or the soft crunch of a wood chip. It was a distinct sound of high-grade steel striking metal. Frowning, Thomas dug his thick fingers into the fertilized soil and pulled out a solid, cylindrical object. He wiped the damp earth away with his thumb. It was a pristine metal rod, exactly 5 inches long, surprisingly heavy, and entirely impervious to rust. It looked like a piece of sophisticated machinery, but as a former mechanic, Thomas knew it didn't belong to any tractor or lawnmower he had ever seen. He polished it on his overalls and held it up to the morning light. Engraved perfectly along the side of the metal was a distinct alphanumeric sequence, ZM 789 T59. Thomas scratched his chin. He figured the heavy machinery the Beaumont women used to grind their agricultural compost had broken apart and had accidentally slipped into his bag. Annoyed at the prospect of jagged metal ruining his soil, he dropped the pin into his pocket, climbed into his rusted pickup truck, and drove toward town. He figured he would show the sheriff. Maybe Miller could get him a refund. 10 minutes later, Thomas walked into the Cypress Cove Sheriff's Station and dropped the heavy metal rod onto the front reception desk with a loud clatter. Senior Investigator Silas Thorne was sitting in the corner, drinking a cup of aggressively stale coffee while reviewing Arthur Pendleton's crime scene photographs. He looked up at the sound. "Bought that expensive compost from the Beaumont girls," Thomas grumbled to the desk deputy. "Found this hunk of metal buried in the powder. Damn near broke my favorite trowel. You ought to tell them their grinding machine is falling apart." Thorne stood up slowly, his predator instincts instantly electrified. He walked over to the desk and picked up the metal rod. He didn't see a broken machine part. Having spent years investigating violent crimes and identifying John does, Thorne knew exactly what he was holding. The weight, the smooth surgical finish, the specific beveled edges. It was a surgical implant. "Mr. Abernathy," Thorne said, his voice dangerously quiet, slicing to the mundane atmosphere of the station. "You found this inside the sealed bag of bone meal?" "Sure did." Thomas nodded, slightly intimidated by the intense, pale-eyed state cop, right in the middle of the white dust. Thorne didn't say another word. He immediately commandeered the sheriff's office, slamming the door shut. He grabbed a heavy black rotary phone and demanded an emergency line to the Ohio State Police Records Department. He had the missing persons file for Chester Gable spread open on the desk. He remembered Gable's wife mentioning a severe car accident years ago. It took 3 agonizing hours of navigating bureaucratic red tape. But finally, a medical records clerk in Akron, Ohio, pulled Chester Gable's hospital file from 1959. Investigator Thorne. The clerk's voice crackled over the static-filled long-distance line. Mr. Gable suffered a compound fracture of the left femur in a head-on collision. The orthopedic surgeons utilized a solid titanium intramedullary nail to stabilize the bone. Thorne's knuckles turned white as he gripped the telephone receiver. "Ma'am, I need you to read me the exact serial number of that surgical implant." "Let's see. It's listed here as Zimmer Manufacturing. Serial number, ZIM-789-59. Thorne stared down at the metal rod resting on his notebook. The numbers matched perfectly. It was irrefutable, indestructible mathematical proof. The missing encyclopedia salesman wasn't just dead. He had been industrially processed, pulverized, and sold as garden fertilizer to the citizens of Cypress Cove. By midnight, Thorne was standing in the mahogany-paneled office of County Judge Harold Lawson in Eureka. He placed a titanium pin on the judge's desk, right next to the sworn affidavit and the forensics report. "You are telling me, Investigator," Judge Lawson whispered, his face completely pale as he looked at the piece of metal, "that these 2 women are boiling people down into face cream?" "Yes, Your Honor, and grinding their skeletons to feed their greenhouse," Thorne said coldly. "I need a no-knock, comprehensive search and excavation warrant for the premises of Botanica Beaumont. We need to tear that property apart, right down to the bedrock." The judge didn't hesitate. He signed the heavy parchment with a trembling hand. Dawn was breaking over the Pacific Ocean, casting a pale, cold blue light over the crashing waves. Back at Botanica Beaumont, Flavia and Consuelo were locked in a frantic, exhausting battle against time and chemistry. The basement reeked of highly concentrated bleach and muriatic acid. Consuelo was furiously scrubbing the drainage grooves of the stainless steel embalming table, while Flavia was frantically burning their leather-bound ledgers in the heavy iron incinerator. "We have to leave, Flavia," Consuelo said, her voice strained, her rubber apron covered in chemical burns. "The drains are clean, but we cannot scrub the dirt in the greenhouse. The roots of the orchids, they are wrapped around bone fragments. The marrow is in the soil. If they bring dogs or shovels, it is over." Flavia stared at the flames consuming her financial records, her beautiful face contorted into a mask of arrogant denial. "We do not run, Connie. We are artists. We are brilliant. They have no proof. They cannot touch us." But as Flavia spoke those words, the deep, rhythmic rumble of heavy engines echoed down the Pacific Coast Highway. Consuelo looked up toward the small basement window. Cutting through the thick morning fog was a convoy of 6 dark, unmarked state police sedans and a heavy forensics transport truck. The flashing red lights reflected off the pristine glass panes of the greenhouse, signaling the absolute, unavoidable end of their perfect empire. The Pacific Coast morning was violently shattered by the synchronized slamming of heavy car doors. At exactly 6 a.m., Senior Investigator Silas Thorne stood on the damp gravel outside Botanica Beaumont, flanked by a dozen heavily armed California State Police troopers and a forensic excavation team wielding shovels, soil sifters, and heavy canvas evidence bags. Thorne didn't bother knocking. He nodded to a burly state trooper holding a solid steel battering ram. With a single, deafening crash, the pristine, gold-leaf-heavy oak door was splintered completely off its brass hinges. "State Police. Search warrant," Thorn roared, his voice cutting fiercely through the suffocatingly sweet aroma of crushed jasmine and rose water. The troopers flooded the immaculate boutique. Heavy leather boots trampled over the polished mahogany floors, knocking over crystal displays and scattering the macabre, expensive ivory bars of soap across the room. The absolute aesthetic perfection of the shop was dismantled in seconds. But Thorn didn't linger in the showroom. He knew the true horrors were hidden in the architecture of the building. He split his team in two. One squad was sent toward the massive glass greenhouse in the rear, while he led the other directly toward the subterranean dark. Out back, the forensic team forced open the heavy glass doors of the conservatory. The humid, heavy air, thick with the rotting meat stench of the blooming amorphophallus titanium, hit the officers like a physical blow. Start with the orchids, the lead forensic technician ordered, pulling on heavy rubber gloves and tying a bandana over his face. Dig them up by the roots. Spades pierced the rich, dark soil of the flower beds. The earth here was unnaturally soft and incredibly dense. Within 10 minutes of digging beneath Flavia's prize-winning ghost orchids, a trooper shovel-struck something that wasn't a root. He knelt, brushing away the damp soil, and pulled out a tarnished, silver peace-sign ring. The exact ring Mary and Starling Miller had been wearing in her missing persons photograph. A few feet away, beneath the massive fleshy leaves of a deadly nightshade plant, another investigator unearthed a rusted metal belt buckle and a scrap of waterlogged gray wool. It was the unmistakable remnant of Chester Gable's cheap suit. But the most horrifying discoveries were deeply entwined with the botany itself. As the team hoisted a massive, vibrant fern from its pot, the thick, white roots of the plant were revealed to be fiercely wrapped around jagged, uncrushed fragments of human jawbone, and a perfectly preserved molar. The plants were literally feeding on the marrow of the dead. The beautiful greenhouse was not a garden. It was a sprawling, shallow grave. Simultaneously, beneath the floorboards, Thorn kicked open the heavy wooden door leading to the basement. He descended the concrete steps, his service revolver drawn, the sharp, blinding glare of the surgical fluorescent light stinging his eyes. The air was a toxic, suffocating cloud of industrial bleach and boiling chemicals. In the center of the sterile, tile-lined slaughterhouse stood Flavia Beaumont and Consuelo Vargas. They were cornered, entirely out of time. Consuelo was standing by the heavy cast-iron rendering pots. The gas burners were roaring, heating a massive vat of highly corrosive lye and muriatic acid. In a desperate, final attempt to destroy the last of their biological evidence, she was preparing to pour the boiling chemical cocktail over the blood-stained stainless steel embalming table and down the deep drainage pipes. She froze as 4 revolvers were leveled directly at her chest. Flavia stood near the wooden curing racks. Even now, with her empire crumbling into ash and state police swarming her sanctuary, she refused to drop her aristocratic facade. She wore her immaculate emerald dressing gown, her dark hair perfectly pinned. She looked at Thorn not with fear, but with an expression profound, burning contempt. "Step away from the vats. Both of you. Hands where I can see them," Thorn commanded, his voice cold and unwavering as he stepped into the room. He glanced at the heavy industrial bone mill in the corner, its hoppers still dusted with the damning white powder. He looked at the surgical scalpels neatly lined up on a metal tray. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Consuelo slowly raised her calloused, chemically burned hands. She understood the absolute pragmatism of defeat. She stepped away from the boiling lye, her dark eyes entirely blank, offering no physical resistance. Flavia, however, lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with terrifying, delusional pride. "You are destroying a masterpiece, Investigator Thorn," she spat, her velvet voice finally cracking with venom. "You trample through my life with your muddy boots, entirely blind to the beauty we created here. We took the absolute dregs of your society, the drifters, the runaways, the pathetic, useless men, and we made them permanent. We made them perfect. Do you have any idea how many wives of senators and judges are washing their faces with my creations right now?" Thorn holstered his weapon and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He walked up to the brilliant, deranged botanist and forcefully grabbed her wrist. "You aren't an artist, Miss Beaumont," Thorn said quietly, his voice echoing in the clinical silence of the basement as he ratcheted the steel cuffs tightly around her delicate wrists. You're just a butcher in a very expensive dress." He turned to the troopers. "Cuff the other one. Read them their rights. Then bag everything. The scalpels, the rendering pots, the soap molds. I want this entire room dismantled and shipped to the state lab in Sacramento." As Flavia and Consuelo were marched up the concrete stairs and out to the shattered front door of their boutique, the morning fog had finally lifted. A crowd of horrified Cypress Cove residents, including a pale and trembling Mrs. Higgins, had gathered on the Pacific Coast Highway, drawn by the sirens and the commotion. They watched in absolute, stunned silence as the two sophisticated women who had brought high society glamour to their small coastal town were shoved into the back of a black police cruiser. The perfect business was dead. The harvest was over. All that remained was the agonizing wait for the gavel to fall. The trial of Flavia Beaumont and Consuelo Vargas in the spring of 1969 did not just dominate the front pages of the Cypress Cove Chronicle. It became a grotesque national obsession. The proceedings were moved to the San Francisco County Courthouse to accommodate the sheer media circus. Every day, the courtroom was packed with reporters, morbidly curious onlookers, and hidden behind dark veils and oversized sunglasses, the horrified socialites who had once been Botanica Beaumont's best customers. Evelyn Harrington, the Pacific Heights heiress who had so lovingly lathered her face with the rendered fat of Elias the Drifter, was reportedly institutionalized for a severe nervous breakdown after investigator Silas Thorne publicly detailed the saponification process on the witness stand. The prosecution's case was an avalanche of irrefutable macabre science. Thorne presented the titanium intramedullary pin belonging to Chester Gable. He brought in the heavy cast-iron rendering pots, still testing positive for human lipid residue despite Consuelo's frantic use of bleach. Most damning of all were the forensic botanists, who testified that the spectacular root systems of Flavia's prize-winning orchids were definitively entwined with human bone fragments. Through it all, the two women sat at the defense table, presenting a chilling dichotomy of absolute madness and pragmatic stoicism. Consuelo Vargas never spoke. She sat with her broad shoulders squared, her calloused hands resting quietly in her lap. She wore standard-issue prison gray, treating the sensational trial with the same detached, functional patience she had applied to butchering her victims. She knew the math. She knew they were caught. There was nothing left to process. Flavia, however, treated the courtroom like a hostile art exhibition, denied her emerald dresses and silk ribbons. She still managed to carry her prison uniform with terrifying, aristocratic posture. Her dark hair was severely tied back, highlighting her sharp, unrepentant features. When the district attorney showed the jury a photograph of the horrific basement slaughterhouse, Flavia did not look away. She simply smiled, a cold, condescending smirk aimed directly at the jury box. "I gave them immortality," Flavia suddenly interrupted during the closing arguments, her velvet voice echoing through the stunned, dead-silent courtroom. The judge furiously banged his gavel, but she ignored him, standing up to face the gallery. "You put these people in the ground to rot. I elevated them. I turned the disposable and forgotten into pure, coveted perfection. You are all hypocrites. You love what I made." It took the jury less than 4 hours to return the verdicts. Guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. The judge, his face pale and his voice trembling with disgust, did not hesitate to hand down the maximum penalty allowed by the state of California: death by lethal gas. 2 years later, on a freezing, fog-choked morning in November 1971, the state prepared to collect its toll at San Quentin State Prison. The heavy, damp air of the bay mirrored the weather of Cypress Cove. Consuelo went first. She walked into the octagonal, apple-green gas chamber with heavy, deliberate steps. She did not look at the gallery of witnesses, nor did she look at Investigator Thorne, who stood in the back row with his hands shoved deep into his trench coat pockets. She sat in the metal chair, allowed the guard to strap her down, and closed her eyes. When the cyanide pellets dropped into vat of sulfuric acid, releasing an invisible, deadly plume of hydrogen cyanide, Consuelo simply took a deep, pragmatic breath. It was over in minutes. She died exactly as she had lived, efficiently, brutally, and without a single word of regret. Flavia's execution, scheduled 2 hours later, was entirely different. She walked into the chamber with her head held high, her eyes wide and burning with that same delusional fire. She looked through the thick glass windows, making direct eye contact with Thorne. She wasn't looking at a man who had defeated her. She was looking at a critic who simply didn't understand her art. As the heavy steel door was sealed shut with a resounding metallic clank, Flavia smiled her flawless, predatory smile one last time. The pellets dropped. The chemical reaction hissed violently beneath her chair. As the lethal gas rose to fill the small, sterile room, Flavia did not panic. She inhaled deeply, perhaps imagining for one final, fractured second that the air smelled not of bitter almonds and death, but of wild lavender, crushed roses, and the absolute perfection of a ruined empire. Miles away, on the jagged coastline of Cypress Cove, the abandoned shop sat rotting under the relentless assault of Pacific storms. The heavy oak door was boarded up, the Botanica Beaumont sign peeling and faded. Inside the sprawling glass greenhouse, left unattended and unheated, the rare orchids had withered and died, returning to the earth. But the soil itself, heavily fortified by the dark harvest of the past, remained unnaturally rich. And every spring, bursting violently through the cracked glass and tangled weeds, a patch of deadly nightshade would bloom with an impossibly vibrant, suffocating beauty, its roots permanently anchored in the marrow of the forgotten,